As the leader of the Australian Labor Party, I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. As many of you do know, Karen Middleton's book outlines a fair bit of it in detail. I did grow up the son of a single mum in a Sydney City Council house in Camperdown and in Sydney. And my mum made a very brave decision in 1963 to keep me a child born out of wedlock to a father who she had met overseas. In 1963, it was not the done thing, of course, and there was enormous pressure on her to have me adopted out, and indeed that was what was supposed to happen. But she couldn't give me up, so she took my father's name, and I grew up thinking my father was dead until I was a teenager, where she could tell me what actually happened. And I got to meet him in December 2009, and he passed away in 2014. My mum died in 2002, 65 years old. She was spent. She had a tough life. She raised me. She was crippled up with rheumatoid arthritis and was on an invalid pension. So we were a two-person family. Families are diverse, they're different. And we shouldn't have a circumstance whereby someone has to have a story in order to be what some people would regard as respectable. I regarded my mother as absolutely a respectable woman and a courageous woman. And I think it does say something good about this country, that someone with my background can serve as Deputy Prime Minister and now be running for the leadership of this country. I tell the story, and I only told the story once my mother had passed away, and because I do think it's important for kids, particularly of diverse families, to actually know that the idea of the nuclear family of mum, dad and two kids actually isn't what everyone is. And so I pay tribute very much to single mums and indeed all parents, particularly those who do it tough, and like a lot of particularly women give up. Some men do it too, give up a lot in the interests of generations to come. One of the things that I also learnt growing up was the concept of community and solidarity. When my mum was in hospital for long intervals, when they changed her drugs, she'd have to go into hospital for a couple of months at a time. Neighbours I was living by myself at a very young age, toughened you up, which is probably pretty handy in the job I've got at the moment. Neighbours would take it in turns to cook meals. I never went hungry, and I relied upon that sense of community in this area of Sydney. It was opposite the kids' hospital. There's one block of housing. It's very different now. It's been gentrified a fair bit now, but there was one block of housing that was just public housing. Everyone was Catholic. Everyone followed rugby league, and it was surrounded by the Children's Hospital across the road, Weston's Biscuit Factory, industrial foundries. There was no one except that community. You had to go across Parramatta Road, that was like crossing Sydney Harbour Bridge. It was 500 metres away. So that little community really looked after each other. And one of my first campaigns, I know an issue of great concern to this organisation and to me, in terms of social housing was that the Conservative forces got control of the council, and they decided they wanted to sell off council housing. And so my first political campaign was as a 12 and 13-year-old kid collecting petitions. We organised a rent strike. It was quite good because when Labor got back in control of the council and overturned the attempt to privatise the housing, they also wrote off the debt for everyone who'd participated in the rent strike. And we thought that was good because the scabs missed out. But it was a sense of solidarity that we had, led by a couple of great old pensioners who organised that political movement. And that was the first one that I was involved in, and one that was very important, and one of the reasons why I got involved in the campaign to try to stop the New South Wales Liberal government selling off housing like at Sirius in the Rocks and the other housing there, was the idea that, you know, poor people shouldn't live in Millers Point or close to the city, is, I think, a fraudulent one indeed. I think that you know, you shouldn't be able to tell people's income by just looking at their postcode. And the logic of selling off housing because it's in a valuable area is one that I certainly don't support. And I think that successful cities are inclusive cities. One of the things I've spoken about as leader as well is that we need to address questions of poverty and intergenerational poverty in particular, because its entrenchment does remain a challenge. We need to actually ensure that a young person, when they're born, you don't automatically know their destiny. We as a society have a responsibility to provide opportunity for people, and so that that benefits the individual, but society's stronger as well if that occurs, if you maximise everyone's potential. There are 320,000 households with dependent children aged under 15. The average gap in life expectancy between the bottom 20% of the population in terms of wealth and the top 20 is 6 years. And that's why your conference theme about harnessing community for effective action is so important, because that concept of harnessing community, which I learnt as a young boy in that council community in Camperdown, is absolutely critical. The idea of bringing people with you, the idea of the strength of the community itself is really important. And ACOSS does that extremely well, advocating for action by working with communities, producing reports such as Poverty in Australia, which explains the challenges facing millions of Australians, all while working with governments and oppositions to achieve meaningful change. You're very much in the front line. You see every day what the impact of poverty is on Australians. Inescapably embedded in the decisions that people have no option but to make. Skipping meals, skipping going to a doctor, making a decision about whether your kid can play sport on the weekend because you're not sure if you can afford the pair of footy boots or netball uniforms. It has a real impact on people, whether people can go on school excursions or not. I remember when I was young, it's funny how some things stick with you. There was one of my mates at school, which was an inner city Catholic school. Very much the inner city was a different place in Sydney from what it is now. But it stuck with me that one of the kids at the time we always used to joke because he had oxygen sandwiches, and didn't realise at the time that what that clearly was going on was that they couldn't afford to put something on the bread. So he just had bread, was all that he could afford. But in order to cover that up, he'd made a joke of it. But we know that poverty isn't actually a joke, that people growing up in households where they can't afford a jar of Vegemite to put on the lunch sandwiches is a demeaning thing for someone to put up with. And in a country as rich as ours, we should not have any child be in that situation. Gough Whitlam said, "Poverty is a national waste as well as an individual waste." And indeed, that's the approach that I have. In recent times, poverty has risen to prominence in several countries with actions. New Zealand has passed under Jacinda Ardern its Child Poverty Reduction Act. That aims to halve child poverty in 10 years. Canada has set targets of a 20% reduction in poverty by 2020 and a 50% drop by 2030 relative to 2015 levels. Australia doesn't have a plan. That's just one part of the challenge. And part of my job over the next 2 and a bit years is to develop a comprehensive set of policies to take to the next election. And one of the policies that I will be taking is centred in this area, working with the wonderful Linda Burney, who's our spokesperson and is here. She's also a good local member. After a redistribution, she's my local member as well. But I can't think of anyone better than Linda Burney. I was a big fan of Jenny Macklin and the work that she did. But in Linda, we have very much a suitable heir to that legacy. And Linda, of course, has a comprehensive experience as well in her life story about the sort of issues that you are concerned about. We do, in this country, I believe, have an ethos that is consistent with the arguments that you put forward, and I believe what is the values and enduring legacy of the Labor Party and what we're about in our values. The fair go is something that we believe in. Australians do pitch in at times of hardship, and we're seeing that at the moment with the bushfires, where you have people really pitching in to help people who are experiencing drought or who are experiencing those natural disasters. What we need to do is make sure that that approach, that concentration on giving people a helping hand doesn't occur just at times of crisis, but occurs consistently. And that's one of the roles of government, to do that. I think Labor's legacy of the age pension introduced by Andrew Fisher, unemployment benefits scheme, Curtin and Chifley, universal super and Medicare with Hawke and Keating, the NDIS and paid parental leave under Rudd and Gillard, shows that there's a common theme when you look at what Labor seeks to do when we're in government. And I do think that contrasts with the current approach. I'm not shocked that often by what occurs on the other side, but I was somewhat shocked that we have a social services minister who described the pension as generous, and who said, with regard to any increase in Newstart, that giving people more money would do absolutely nothing. Probably all it would do is give drug dealers more money and give pubs more money. It's a pretty extraordinary statement for a social services minister to make. The Coalition's leaked talking points say, and you'll hear this all the time, the best form of welfare is a job. Of course that's right. Of course that's right. People being in employment is a good thing, but not everyone can. My mum couldn't work. She, though, contributed something to society for herself. She was would help out around the neighbourhood. She volunteered at the local church, and she raised me. And the idea that people just get dismissed in that way is, I think, pretty unacceptable. The fact is that unemployment sits at 12% in many areas of Australia, and in many places youth unemployment, of course, is above 20%. And the fact is there are many more people seeking work, some 2 million Australians, than there are jobs available. So I'm here to say that I want to work with you. I want to work with you on all of these issues. I want to make sure that we maximise opportunities for people. It is of concern that we have a whole range of jobs where we simply don't train people for them because it's easier. The lazy option is just to import labour temporarily. That's why we want to create Jobs and Skills Australia in the first vision statement that I made, so that we train Australians for the jobs that are available, and we try and predict as well, plan for labour force participation, just like we plan for infrastructure and for other things as well. I do want to say that the Senate inquiry into Newstart that Labor supported has heard some heartbreaking stories. People who simply can't afford the basics and essentials of life, people not being treated with respect. We know that almost half of those on Newstart are aged over 45, and we know the biggest growth is people who are aged over 55. We know as well that in terms of Newstart, that $1 given to a Newstart recipient is going to be spent, not saved. So would therefore contribute to job creation and to less people being on Newstart as well, which would be a good thing at a time where the economy is really struggling. I do want to say as well that with regard to First Nations people, we went to the election saying that we'd abolish the CDP and establish a new program to be developed in partnership, which would have some of the same features as the old CDP, and we remain committed to our proposal. We of course have a view about constitutional recognition, but we also want practical measures to close the gap in so many areas. Last time we were in government, it was a difficult time. We had the global financial crisis. Labor saw Australia through that crisis. This government's presiding over an economy that has rising unemployment in the latest figures, 2 million underemployed, has wages not keeping up with inflation, has growth being downgraded, has retail spending down to 1990s levels, has productivity going backwards. All of the key economic indicators that are so important for an economy are simply not moving forward in a way that we support. So I look forward to working with you into the future over the next couple of years, and I certainly hope beyond that. I think that a Labor government with Linda Burney as a minister and with the leadership that we have in place would be one of which you would be proud. And I certainly, each and every day, when I'm making decisions, I often think to myself, what would my mum think about that? Often that comes up with less politically correct answers than what some people would think. But it does mean that I'm prepared to make tough decisions as well, to send messages. For example, the message I sent about treatment and respect for women by getting rid of someone from the party I lead. I am prepared to do that. I am prepared to show leadership on these issues. We won't be releasing all of our policies here or in the next month. We've learnt some lessons from the election campaign. We've had the review. Its recommendations are very clear about a path forward. I'm now outlining in a series of vision statements, much of which will be in areas of interest to you between now and next May's budget. We'll develop the platform of the party in the lead up to National Conference. It'll be held right here next December. But we will have a comprehensive suite of policies going forward, and we'll be engaging with you as we develop those. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and of course we're delighted that you're happy to stay and take questions. Unfortunately, the Minister yesterday wasn't able to do that. So can
I'm
I?
not surprised.
Can I?
We have trouble getting questions answered in question time.
Can I?
If they're difficult, I've brought Linda though, so if they're difficult, I'll flip them.
Can I acknowledge that this is the first time that you've spoken at the ACOSS conference as the leader of the opposition, and so I've got a job to do. I've certainly heard.
I have spoken here before.
You have.
As the Parliamentary Secretary for Family and Community Services, and as housing spokesperson.
Here we are. Look, you might not know, but my story it's the same and different to yours. So I was born in 1964. And I was also born single
so you're older.
Single mum by a year.
You're not. I'm older, by the way.
And but there was no single parent payment at the time, of course. And so my mum, she was from an Irish Catholic background, and she adopted me out. That was the reason, because there was no income support at all. And you talked about some of the legacy, from previous Labor leaders, and of course in this community we often remind leaders about the really important commitment that Bob Hawke made. It was not a slip of the tongue when he committed to ending child poverty in Australia. And what's not often known as well is that actually by the policies that were introduced during his government, he reduced child poverty by a third. So it's entirely possible to end poverty, actually. And you talked about the Jacinda Ardern approach of legislation. So I do want to ask you, are you prepared to commit to a poverty reduction target, to set a target and to set a timetable, and then to work with us on introducing the policies that are needed to get there? Because there's nothing better than a real commitment to us actually ensuring that all those kids that you're talking about, and it is real, do have enough food on the table.
Look, I'm not in a position today to do that, because one of the things that I've committed to as well is to make sure that we have proper processes through our cabinet, the shadow cabinet, through our party processes. And we've just finished the review, and specific policies we've said will now give consideration to. The vision statement puts out the values, if you like, the principles that would be guided. But I can say I'm very sympathetic with that view as well. I was there when Bob Hawke made the commitment at the Sydney Opera House, and it was a very important commitment. And I think it does make a difference knowing what it's like to not have literally any money, zero, for a while. And to my mum was a pretty good manager of money, I've got to say. She when she died, she was ahead in her rent, 6 weeks. And the most bizarre thing, she was ahead in because she used to get, you'd go to the post office, you'd get stamps and put them in a little book to pay for your phone and all of that. She was unbelievable. She was ahead in her Myers card. Now, they owed her money. So, why they, of course they wouldn't have done that. But I think I got, $23 or something, and I'm not quite sure how that happened, that she was ahead there. But so we never, you know, I was never hungry, but I knew people who were, and certainly there were things that, you know, we went without.
What we know from the research that's being done now is that the kids tend to not be the ones that go hungry, it's the mums and the parents that hide the fact that they're not eating.
Yep.
That's going on every day, you know, at the moment. Look,
I've heard a bit about I can commit to work with you towards that end, but
a plan. Sure. I think if we could get a commitment from you today to work with us on a plan, we'll work with that.
Yep, yeah? We can certainly have that.
We're very aware, and I think respect the fact that when you're in opposition and so close after an election, it is appropriate that you are spending time listening. That is what we have all said. You have to spend time in communities listening. And so I'm not going to want to push you too far, because actually that is a really important process that you're going through, and our main request today is for you to work with us on that. There's a couple of things I wanted to, first of all, really acknowledge the important positions that you have been taking in opposition on opposing random drug testing. It is really important that you have opposed that. It's really important that you are doing the work that you're doing on robo-debt. And again, I want to acknowledge all the advocates in this room for the incredible work that you have done, and also to acknowledge the work that the Labor Party is doing of bringing the government to account on that. I want to acknowledge overnight also with the cashless debit card. We're aware it's been really important for Labor to take its position opposing any extension of the cashless debit card, and we've got overnight, again, Senator Lambie having said she's going to have a think about it. So we're going to work with that. So these are really important commitments you're making. So these commitments for what the government's planning to do is really important. I want to talk about, though, I know because you're here as leader, this is the first opportunity for you to reflect on some of the decisions that a Labor government did make. We know that the cutting of the single parent payment post the GFC was harsh and brutal and really affected so many single parents, and, you know, helped us to get to a significant increase in child poverty rates as a result of that. And of course, many in this room were deeply frustrated we could not get a commitment from your party on increasing New Start. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, on the actions that we took in government, one of the things about that was that, and I said this at the time in a forum that I was in, that was included in a budget whereby I certainly didn't participate in any process and found out about it effectively on budget day. It was a part of appropriations. So there was no vote on it. And I said that at the time I told in a forum I'm not allowed to talk about for 30 years or whatever it is. You'll see the minutes. And I think we've reduced that, so you'll see it sooner than then what my views were. They were pretty strong because I didn't see that coming. And I think that was a bad decision.
That was a mistake.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I, in the forum, and if there was a vote in the Parliament, I certainly wouldn't have voted for it, with all the consequences that would have had. With regard to New Start, I've said it should be increased. We've said it should be increased, that it's not enough. We haven't put a figure on it for two reasons. One, because if we put a figure on it, that lets the government off the hook, and we think it should be increased now, not in 2022, well, our first budget if we're successful. So we don't want to let them off the hook effectively on that. But we have said that it should be increased, and we've argued that in the Parliament and in the community, and we'll continue to do so. $40 a week a day is simply not enough to live on. And if you accept that, then you therefore can't accept that it should stay the same. I think also that it's bad for individuals, but it's also bad for, in a couple of other ways as well. If an individual is struggling to survive, they're going to be less likely to actually get employment, to get off New Start, because it goes to a sense of confidence. It goes to, what clothes you can afford to wear to a job interview. It goes to getting to the job interview. It goes to your whole sense of being and who you are.
And we've got a lot of people who are directly involved in the campaign to raise the rate, who are really the experts on why
it's been a great campaign.
As you know, about why money matters. And if anybody says that money doesn't matter, doesn't know what it's like.
That's right.
Questions from the audience? I know that's actually really key, so we'll pass them around.
Look, firstly, thank you for the courage to share your story at a public forum like this, and for showing the resilience as well that you have. I can't comment on the run on specifics of someone's case. I can't do that because it's not appropriate for me to do that. What is appropriate for me to say, though, is that people who have a disability should be eligible either for the DSP or for assistance as well for the NDIS. We have, if you're based in Far North Queensland, we have a senator based there, and her office, Nita Green, is based in Cairns. I'm not quite sure whether that's the area that you're from.
Catter. I'm Catter country. Bob Catter.
Oh, Catter. Okay. Bob Catter, whatever his issues, I think he's someone who I'm happy to get your details and speak to someone in Bob's office, so someone closer to where you are, to do that, if we could organise to do that, and I'll speak to him today about that.
Thank you. Question. Thank you. Other question?
Well, thanks very much, Duncan. I'm almost inclined to do a Q&A response, channel Tony Jones, and say I'll take that as a comment, because I think you're right. People shouldn't be punished for being poor, and people also, we need to do much better at providing people with pathways out of poverty. And part of that, in my view, is looking at housing and looking at communities as well. The community I grew up in was a bit different council housing, because it different from what it looks like now. It's now run by the housing department, and I go back to that community, and I'm really concerned that over a period of time as well, the concentration of disadvantage, you can only get into public housing if you're really disadvantaged, and that concentration of kids growing up in communities where there aren't people in work, and that concentration has a bad impact as well. One of the things about where I grew up was people who worked at the council, or there were people who worked on the wharves. There was a Comcar driver, bizarrely. There was a mix of people, and that provided you with an experience which, if you have a community that's solely based on a concentration of poverty, that's a problem. So one of the things I want to work towards as well is a significant increase in social housing, in looking after people in social housing, not just welfare housing. I see no reason why, every galah in the pet shop can make money out of housing, but governments say, the only way we can build a house is to flog a house off.
Government's got the cheapest access to
to
financing.
money's free.
And if you want
at
to
the
do
moment.
something, if you want to do something for the country, you want to invest in public and social housing,
Absolutely.
which hasn't been done for how long is it now? 2 decades.
Yep.
So.
Thanks very much as well for sharing your story. Unfortunately, I know that your story is not uncommon. I have in my offices just down the road from, well, not down the road, we're 3 doors from the Centrelink agency. And so my office deals with just a range of people who just tell stories of frustration and that they want to work, they want support, but they don't get it. They go through a tick the box exercise. And, these agencies I think one of the times I spoke at ACOSS as well, I was in charge of employment services and training in opposition, which is when under the Howard government there was the privatisation essentially of employment services occurred. And the tragedy is that there are some agencies that do fantastic work. Well, there are some. There are some, and to say there aren't any doesn't actually advance the debate. So what we need to do is to make sure that all agencies that are providing services, whether they be public or private, are providing good services, and that experiences like yours are weeded out. So yes, of course we would, if we're in government, be examining the system to make sure that it actually does what it's supposed to do, which is to provide assistance for people, treat people with respect, and actually deliver better outcomes, because that's better for individuals who participate in the scheme, but it's also better for the country if that is happening.
I know I'm now being told we're seriously starting to run out of time, but I've got one more question.
No Republic either!
Yeah, thank you. We're about to have the MyEFO announced by the government. There's a lot of debate about what we should be doing about the economy. You'll be aware that in the lead up to the election, ACOSS and our members warned against eye-watering tax cuts for the country. We said the offering from the now government that they could deliver a surplus, that they could give the largest income tax cuts the country's ever seen, and also guarantee essential services was never going to happen. We've got a Royal Commission into Aged Care. 2.5 billion won't touch the sides to fill the gap. We don't even have a dental scheme in Australia. We estimate there's about 3 billion in the gap that's needed to finally fix mental health services for people. Of course, what we've talked about in terms of social security, New Start, and actually we've finally got some recognition from the government that when you're talking about really great jobs for the community, you invest in the services that people need in communities. So, we had some good discussion yesterday about what a good economic package might look like. Do you agree that right now we don't need tax cuts? We don't need to bring forward tax cuts. What we need to do is put money in the hands of people who desperately need it, and that one of the best things we could do would be to increase New Start and invest in social housing as great infrastructure that's got plenty of jobs in it, and make sure that we've got the revenue we're going to need to fill these huge gaps in essential services for the Australian community.
Look, we opposed stage 3 of the tax cuts. The parliament that the Australian people elected meant that we weren't able to exclude, because that's where the big dollars are in that stage 3. We weren't able to remove that. We're only one vote short. Jackie Lambie we thought we had with us for a period, but she didn't vote with us. So had that happened, the government would have then been faced with a dilemma, a reverse wedge of having to either cop that decision or not have any tax cuts at all. The first stage of the tax cuts, which was what was the only one that was immediate for this term, was for low and middle income earners. We went to the election supporting that. So we didn't...
The low income earners are people who are on New Start.
Understand that.
And on the pension.
And we at the same time argued...
Who are not getting any of the benefit out of the tax cuts. So.
Yes, we argued and continue to argue that a great way, the easiest way to do stimulus, which the economy needs, is to increase New Start. That would be a very sensible thing. Every single dollar of it would be spent. And that is our position. We'll wait and see what they do on MyEFO, but I think that the economy is really struggling, and we saw indeed that the first stage delivered, was up to $1,080, but it was nothing like that for most people, and that people, because of uncertainty in the economy as well, didn't spend it. If you gave it money for a New Start increase, would certainly be spent and would circulate around the economy and would therefore create jobs and would therefore lead to less people on New Start.
And people who really need income relief would finally get some.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm now seriously in trouble.
I'm always in trouble.
Please thank the Leader of the Opposition.